Sometimes, a game can be sold on its premise alone. A one-sentence summary of a game's core ideas, if compelling enough, can do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to getting a player to give it a try. Provided that it somewhat matches what it promised in its elevator pitch, any given title can survive by simply presenting something different, or a new spin on an existing idea. This can be as simple as just being the sequel or spiritual successor to an already liked game, or in the more interesting cases, something unique. As its full government name suggests, Stray Gods is a marrying of traditional, choice-based mechanics and musical theatre, a criminally neglected tactic that every game can benefit from, regardless of whether there is a canonical reason for including a musical number. Whilst it certainly has its issues, Stray Gods was well written enough and offered a world that was worth experiencing, and characters that were worth getting to know, even if it meant enduring a few inconsistencies in its messaging. With a strong creative identity, it is a game that I cannot recommend enough, both to existing fans of musicals and their surrounding media, or for someone looking to break in the monotony of the AAA space. It isn't a perfect game, but Stray Gods is a title about finding your muse and finding a game to be lost in the moment with. Oh look, he said the title. If I were being conservative, I would say that Stray Gods as a concept matches many of my general interests. And if I were being exaggerative, Stray Gods is a game that I would like to as it both understands and is willing to accommodate my various kinks, Greek mythology, musical theatre inspirations, 2003 BioWare, and it was made in Australia. That one's less important. It was developed by Summerfall Studios, a Melbourne-based development team, and was led by writer David Gader. His previous position at BioWare means that he has an impressive portfolio, including having written for Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, which happens to be one of my favourite games of all time. It was announced at PAX Australia during Gader's keynote address. Originally titled Chorus, an adventure musical, it would be published by Humble Games. An hour-long event called Myth and Music would be hosted and live-streamed on Critical Role's channel, where Troy Baker, who plays Apollo in the game, unveiled the remainder of the cast. A veritable who's who of the voice acting catalogue. Various live performances were completed as well as a Q&A with the cast. The game released generally positive reviews, and though a story expansion would be released, the studio have made it clear that the next project is unlikely to be one of the musical variety. The fact that there is indeed a next project is an uplifting one, given that when these sorts of games don't hit it big on the sales number side, the corporate entities behind the scenes are usually all too quick to pull the trigger on layoffs or a complete shattering of the team. Stray Gods follows Grace, a college dropout who, after meeting her at a tryout for her band, finds herself accused of murdering the lost muse Calliope, and sentenced to death by the Chorus, a pantheon of the remaining Greek gods. Given a week to prove her innocence before the trial, she must piece together just who killed the music. The ways that Stray Gods presents and builds on the common understandings of the Greek pantheon is as strong as a graphene sheet. Given that the Greek gods have a similar level of interpersonal conflict as the characters of EastEnders, it is entirely reasonable that they would be capable of murdering one of their own, for whatever petty reasons that may transpire. This is a family who, after staying still for so long, finds themselves struggling to push forward and is, put simply, broken. Each person isn't doing particularly well, and Grace will either be the catalyst for their adaptation into a new era, or their downfall. The way that Stray Gods interprets and adds its own concepts into the creative crucible is an engrossing one. The central conceit being that the power of the gods is contained in something called an eidolon, which when they die is passed on to someone else. That person then gains the powers of that god, and over time, their memories too. As time progresses, they essentially become that god, likely taking their name and personality. An extremely interesting idea that unfortunately the game only touches upon before moving on. The idea that by inheriting this power you are essentially losing yourself and accepting that you will become someone else is a frightening one, and Grace reacts incredulously to it. However, the game has far too many things that it is juggling, waving this off to deal with the more pressing concern of Calliope's murder. Focusing on its central plot is a wise decision, as diluting it with such a large theme of identity when the game is already wrestling with its notions of moving forward would only really serve to hurt both. It did, however, leave me wishing that it had more time, or games, to explore that idea, as it has enough meat on it in order to be its own meal. Fate is a trap for a plot to fall into, though I'm going to quickly run out of phrasings to say that Stray Gods doesn't do so compared to others. A narrative that has prophecy of some kind often dances itself into a corner. Either a character defies prophecy and renders the certainties of fate that have been established mute, or a prophecy comes to pass and therefore the agency of the protagonist is diminished. Often a writer will attempt to include some kind of twist. Stray Gods instead opts to found lore and withhold details to retain intrigue. Prophecies do exist, but someone is not bound to one until they learn of it, which I find to be an intoxicatingly beautiful paradigm. As a result, Apollo refuses to tell Grace of a prophecy pertaining to her, which allows the mystery to continue and for her to still have a choice in this matter. It certainly isn't ideal that a writer must withhold certain details from the audience, not by choice but by design, but it is a necessary evil to keep things interesting. Actually, it's something writers do all the time, especially in murder mystery. There surely is some comment to be made that the fallibility of prophecy and choice in a narrative is similar to that of the adventure genre. The central story of an adventure game is the fate that we are resigned to no matter our choices, but perhaps anything is possible until we shatter that illusion and learn of the fate that we are shackled to, and just how limited our choices are. Not particularly relevant, but I have to pad the video's runtime somehow, don't I? The extended cast that makes up Stray Gods is ultimately well designed and well characterized. Their aesthetic and designs are all quite strong, with particular shoutouts to Hecate, Asterion, Aphrodite, and the simple yet elegant stylings of our protagonist, Grace. It can be quite challenging in order to create a defined character that also allows the player to guide them, though Stray Gods manages to circumvent this issue. Some games, such as Detroit Become Human, abandon this by making their characters more akin to blank slates, which gives the player ultimate control over what the personality of the person they are controlling is, but it also makes the character usually not as compelling. It's much more challenging to write genuine emotion and a good core of a character if you're trying to give the player that level of control over them, though this is something that Stray Gods does avoid, like I said. Grace is strong, likable, and has a clear sense of purpose and direction. It helps that she's driven by a universal desire to not be punished for a crime you didn't commit, like a slightly less endearing Ishiban Kasuga. I'm kidding. I love Grace. I can't believe I lost and found her when I played Elden Ring. As a choice-based narrative adventure game, Stray Gods contains all the hallmarks of one. The plot will develop in whatever form the game is using, occasionally pausing to allow you to choose a dialogue option for the protagonist. Where Stray Gods differs is that it does not use the so-called critical choices that other adventure games may use. Including such choices could take away from the impact and influence of the game's musical numbers, the crux of its plot, and so it avoids using them, which is ultimately for the best. During major events, the aspect ratio will change, the environment will likely fade into the void so that it can be replaced by one that better represents the song, and the player will intermittently be asked to make a decision that impacts where the next section of the song will go. It is a direct result of the choice, which is one of the most unique and immediately gratifying uses of interactive storytelling. All moments in the game are marked by 3 choices, each associated with a particular colour. Red is for the most bold and often more aggressive options, blunt in its approach. Blue is supposed to prioritise wit and logic, where the dialogue is more strategic. The final is green, which aims to build emotional rapport with someone, expressing empathy toward a given situation or attempting to connect with someone on a more intimate level. Overall, your dialogue choices have little effect on the actual plot, but play a role in what kind of person the protagonist will be. The foundation for Grace's character is laid, but the intricacies of how that is expressed is up to you. This has a much greater effect during songs, as it alters not just the lyrical themes, but the musical style as well. Depending on your choice, the timbre and genre of the musical number will adapt and flow. Choosing the red option at first will likely lead to a faster pace or harder percussion. Green might favour strings for a softer touch, and blue... well, I never really chose blue. There's a greater complexity to the system, that is, the order of which you choose will change the section. It's not like they composed a part for a choice and it just plugs it into the song. Choosing red and then green will build a different second section than choosing blue and green, for example. However, it is in the climax of Aphrodite's storyline that we see Stray Gods at its best and worst simultaneously in this regard. And here is a trigger warning for the taking of someone's life. The Ritual is a song that exemplifies how Stray Gods' commitment to each choice, exploring difficult musical styles and emotions, leads to some feeling more suitable than others for a situation, almost removing the need for a choice. In these scenarios, it's less about choosing what kind of person Grace wants to be, and more about choosing the only option that really makes sense. But the climax of Aphrodite's storyline provides some unwanted implications. To provide context, Aphrodite is struggling, caught in her grief and pain and longing for a path out of it. After the gods were betrayed and Aphrodite was captured by humans, her husband Hephaestus made a deal, one that traded her freedom for his. Having resented him and feeling as though she had been cold to him throughout their marriage, Aphrodite is racked by guilt and sorrow for someone who loved her more than she loved him. And so, Aphrodite practices a ritual that allows her to pass her powers onto a mortal before her so-called death. That person then has a period where they lack her memories and therefore her grief. Over time, her memories will return for that person, including the nightmares and sadness which leads to the cycle beginning anew. We talk to those around Aphrodite and it becomes clear that they're hurt at losing a friend and family member, but unwilling to try and stop her, as they can't stand to see her in such pain. Songs in a musical are inherently dramatic, though the ritual doesn't feel as such. It feels more like a final plea, one last cry for help, a person's struggle with the weight of history laid bare for everyone to see. Especially games can sometimes use suicide for drama. The pronounced nature of Stray Gods' musical number is merely a side effect of the character's desperation, not the desperation of a plot to mean something, as it often is. Out of the 3 paths and versions of the song, each led to a different reaction from myself. The first, the blue path, is enough of a tonal discrepancy musically that I never really chose it, and have only ever paid attention to it once. I find that the second, red, is a fundamentally solid tune, but it is a symptom of an approach to suicide that I feel is the equivalent of playing with fire. It is with the third that I feel as though Stray Gods manages to provide a mature and sensitive reaction to a difficult situation, that expresses a message that I found to be a comforting one. It is worth noting once again that this is extremely subjective, given that it is informed by my own experiences and personal reactions to a delicate matter. I would like to say that there is no correct response to someone in your life struggling with suicidal thoughts, and I implore anybody in that unfortunate position to educate themselves on the matter before action. I'll include resources in the description that are written and researched by professional sources, should you wish to read into it more. The red option, as it takes suit most of the time, is far more aggressive, though to give it its credit, Stray Gods is a game that knows when to rein that in. Grace begins by almost scolding Aphrodite, as if she's been biting her tongue to respond to someone's selfish actions. She says that she'd love to see Hephaestus' face, if he could see what the goddess of love has been reduced to. This is followed up by the entire group chiming in to support Grace's vocals, as she wonders what Hephaestus sacrificed for if Aphrodite is willing to take her own life. Aphrodite's following verse is defensive, as she reflexively questions Grace's motivations and credentials. She proclaims that everybody here wants to wallow in her testimony, a line that almost proves the idea that she's inviting their pity, especially since this is a lie. We know it's not true. There's an entire section before the song of everyone telling you that they hate what's happening. Eros, Aphrodite's son, joins the song. He sings about how their family is decaying and that he never thought she'd let it get like this, implying that it's her fault. And as this is going on, I can't help but feel that this is quite wrong. My issues with the song is that I feel as though the red option, in this scenario, leads to a rather callous reaction. A grief-stricken goddess who has lost her love and will to live, wanting to take her own life, and the reaction almost implies blame on her part, that she's being selfish and that everybody wants her to be okay and to fall in love once again. But it's Aphrodite's self-indulgence in this ritual that is betraying what her husband died for. The villainization of those with similar thoughts is something that media can often fall into. I fear that the red path threatens to stray into that territory. I feared that this would happen and so actively avoided the choice, which doesn't so much make a hard choice easier, but completely lock off what I consider to be one of the game's best songs musically. The bass line is pitch perfect, bringing that energy and edge that the lyrics are going for. It's a great listen and the song I fire up the most for a quick listen, but it is one that I feel is at odds with the topic it's discussing. This resolution feels as though it's on a knife's edge. It could either help Aphrodite realize the true nature of the situation, or it could reinforce a negative thought, making her feel as though those around her and that she loves are disappointed in her and blame her, which, at least from my own experience, potentially leads to self-destruction as a punishment. Rather than a catchy hook, the green path is decidedly more somber. Strings cut through the air, the vocals remain softer. Grace recognizes Aphrodite's feelings, acknowledging that she can't imagine the true nature of them. She asks what good is a flame when everything's ash? What good is continuing on when you feel as though there is nothing around you? Instead of declaring that everybody is ready to say goodbye to her, Aphrodite shares Grace's words, asking whether she can imagine people gathering to say goodbye to someone they love. Like she knows the truth, but it's difficult to say. The song's central idea is introduced of being lost in a moment, caught in a single frame, wrapped in the embrace of one single thought. It's touching, as there's to be a genuine attempt to understand and care for someone who is hurting. And then a song starts singing. There is something to the imperfection of Abubakar Salim's performance in this moment that is so heartbreaking. The layers of the orchestra slow, punctuating the pauses in his words. He tells his mother that he accepts her choice and that he won't stop her if it's causing her pain. Eros' voice breaks as he sings so. It's such a genuine and raw expression of emotion that it speaks to his experiences of being left to pick up the pieces. He and Grace sing together, lost in a moment where everyone, not just Aphrodite, is caught and stuck in that painful memory. The music picks up. Acoustic guitars strum as their voices swell, navigating each other as universal thoughts and feelings are shared for the first time. Percussion, background in its nature, but helpful to bring everything together, arrives along with the others in attendance. Everyone sings together as Aphrodite joins them, their plight and unity radiating from every chord and every note. They've all been lost in a moment, but it's by stepping forward together that maybe, just maybe, things might turn out okay. It feels as though Eros' testimony reminds his mother that she is their flame, and their family isn't ash, not yet. They're still together. She's not alone. Depression and suicidal thoughts are inherently irrational. It's easy to know when they dominate your mind, but it's difficult to discern which thoughts are depressive and which are genuine. In the case of the ritual, 2 of the choices are logical. Blue is the option in the game that is based on reasoning, whilst the blunt option that occupies red is based on expressing potentially true ideas in a forthcoming manner. The problem is that a rational solution to something irrational doesn't really fit. On the other hand, I wouldn't really consider emotion and an empathetic approach to be rational. It's very difficult to describe an emotion. It's difficult to describe why you understand what someone's going through. But sometimes an experience is just universal enough that you do. Whilst I stand by the previous point, that I feel as though Stray Gods is often rendered mute by the actual scene in regards to its choices, and the ritual is just the most potent example of that, as it deals with a sensitive topic, Stray Gods solves this issue as best as it can. It is said by Pan that Grace can make them sing, but the song will always be theirs. It will always be how they truly feel, which does make at least one of the options feel out of place from the get-go. Yes, red is often the symbol of anger and determination being brought to the forefront, and as a result, taking a song to that place was an escalation that yielded a satisfying arc for the tune itself. Whilst you could argue that some people do blame Aphrodite for the situation that they're in, and therefore red is the most real example of expressing true feelings, there's a time and a place. It may be the right words, but it's the wrong time, and it's the wrong conversation to say them in, if at all. The fluidity and willingness to go with the flow of a song means that it's incredibly unlikely that you have the exact same playthrough as somebody else. This is usually a bold-faced lie on the back of the box, but this is one of the few cases where that is true. In the ritual, red feels appropriate as a final choice, but the song picks up as the culmination of what's been said. It adds a hint of defiance in Aphrodite's recourse, the idea that your story is not over and she doesn't want this to be the end. There's a flame in her still and her family's not ash. This is something that broke me the first time I played the game, because I share the feeling. Whilst it's not as easy as just saying I'm not going to give in to these thoughts, the general anger and determination to not let it end like this, the memory of me be tainted by an action that a lot of people wouldn't understand, I get that. They each sing together. Apollo sings to hold on, as when you're struggling, all you can do is take one thing at a time, and find comfort with those around you. I love this game. My thoughts regarding the song are difficult to convey, and I apologise if the previous session was a bit of a mess. I began writing this video as a review of a game I very much enjoyed. In doing so, I felt that the ritual is an interesting confluence of everything Stray Gods is at its core, and worth talking about at length, both in the positive and negative sense. Whilst the previous section was quite long and was a conversation that's less about Stray Gods' quality and more about the intricacies of a specific moment, I think that by discussing it, I touch upon what I think are both Stray Gods' overall positives and negatives. I think that Stray Gods' ability to introduce those conversations and portray two sides of a complex debate is admirable. The gaming industry often shies away from these discussions, and I hope that it was a fruitful one regardless. The only other gripe I have is that it made things sort of formulaic, where I often chose green and followed it up with red as that felt like the best way to approach a scene. This is a me thing though. Stray Gods' choices are sometimes overall quite rigid, not appropriate, but sometimes that's part of navigating this world, as sometimes there isn't much of a choice. This isn't truly a negative thought with the game. It's a matter of my own thoughts regarding a subject it is engaging with, making it so that there's only one choice, at least for me. Empathy in the scenario and truly using the musical format feels much more human. I rarely found myself choosing red initially, but it did become a place for the song to go naturally for my first playthrough. My interpretation of Grace was a slightly more measured one. Music can be connection on a spiritual level, a way to express things that can't be said. When words aren't enough, you sing. That's the fundamental idea behind Grace. The canon explanation as to why everyone is singing is that she's inherited Calliope's power, who as a muse, can cause spontaneous musical numbers. Like a more proactive version of Zoe's extraordinary playlist. So safe to say I hated the choices, but I loved them too. The actual music was a collaborative endeavour. It was an effort led by Austin Wintory, as I mentioned earlier, but included efforts from Montaigne, musician and streamer who represented Australia in Eurovision 2021, and Tripod, a comedy rock triplet. These songs are incredibly well constructed and appropriate for their scenes, aside from a handful of exceptions. To indulge myself with a selfish complaint, its drive to ensure that every song is hyper-focused on the moment doesn't make it a particularly listenable soundtrack outside of the game. Obviously, some games are able to balance this. Undertale is a good example of a game with a fitting soundtrack that happens to be capable of stirring an emotion or two. Mostly whatever emotion is tied to the dance from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Regarding the majority of the soundtrack, they do a phenomenal job of layering sounds to create a complex soundscape that remains consistent in its instrumentation. The composers have a true skill of ensuring that the game has a unique identity, both the musical songs and the background soundtrack. A somewhat varying quality regarding the performances and sound mixing leads to a slight feeling of amateurness, something that is very rare though when playing through the game. At parts this feels intentional, such as during Astarion's number towards Hecate. It's the perfect blend of everything Stray Gods' script does well. It's clumsy, it's self-aware, though that is indeed the point. It's a reflection of the moment. Astarion is not a singer, nor is he someone who can be considered coherent at expressing emotions, but it is a well-meaning and lovable character who is just attempting to be honest. In other times, certain performances stray ahead of the beat or just don't flow particularly well, a particularly noticeable issue, when other performances are flawless. It's a small thing, and never truly detracted, though it did catch my attention occasionally. I would also like to add that the lack of a chapter replay of any kind means that if you want to revisit certain songs and find out what the other options were, you have to play through the entire game again, which sucks. There is potential to grow closer to particular members of the cast should you wish to. Most of the options are members of the Greek pantheon, and it is rather easy to embark on one of these paths. To avoid accidental riz, each of the choices is marked with a heart. The various romantic options are okay, and do manage to add something to the overall game. Grace seemingly struggles with romance, and so it is nice to see her find somebody, though that does happen in the course of 5 days or so, which is a bit fast. The game is also more than welcome to let you romance whoever you'd like, which is great. If you're wondering, I chose Apollo. Stray Gods uses a comic book style, where characters will alternate between various poses to denote what they are attempting to convey. I would imagine that this was both a stylistic choice and a practical one. It's more efficient to draw each character in a number of poses that covers a varying scope of emotions, which can then be selected for a chosen scene, than it is to hand animate every frame. Though the trailer does initially include that level of animation, it does make me long for it, even if it were only used in songs. It does a good job of reflecting what Stray Gods' central ideas are. It is a game whose world and general narrative themes are informed by the idea that the Greek gods, ancient beings with ancient ideas, are interacting with a modern way of doing things. There is something quietly poetic about the stylized graphic novel look, almost as though it is a modern format to immortalize this new story in. In an attempt to mix up its gameplay, Stray Gods has a few minor variations in its delivery. There is a map, which is either a thinly disguised choice where you can choose to visit and talk to characters in specific moments to either further their romantic endeavours, or just a transition between scenes. It is usually just an extra step, and not one that adds much, nor takes us away from anything. Sometimes you'll enter a location and have a list of people or items to interact with. It's another meaningless obstruction, as the order chosen does not matter, and to progress you usually have to select every option. Other than that, it just allows you to ask questions before getting to colour choices. It's purely for world building and does not impact the narrative path. There aren't really any puzzles aside from the game's central mystery of Calliope's murder. Even then, this is where the game falls short in its largest way. I've spent long enough debating the choices in Stray Gods, though it is worth adding that the narrative is not necessarily being affected by your decision. It is once again more about how you reach the game's critical points that matters, who you love, who you hate, and who you choose to help. Despite its characters being its greatest strength, Stray Gods doesn't quite know the destination for its narrative. When it comes to reaching a conclusion of central mystery, it goes with the most likely candidate. The journey is well written, and full of intrigue that is a joy to experience. It feels as though you are figuring out the story, not just alongside the characters, but the writers as well, which is a unique feeling, until we reach time for an answer. Then it feels like a desperate scramble to figure out who the culprit is before the player does. An unfortunate vibe to give, considering they end up settling on the most predictable offender. Considering that the bulk of the game is about visiting and remedying the various problems of its cast, it should be of little surprise that it's the one major character that hastily sentences Grace to death on a suspicion and that we do not visit with a song that happens to be the murderer. It is her issue, namely that she lives in the past status quo of being the warrior protector of the family, that causes her to kill Calliope. Furthermore, the prophecy I mused on earlier, pun absolutely intended, ends up being exactly true. Vague wording aside, there's not much of a twist to this. The only thing that's different is the perspective that we look upon it with. Whilst I did just spoil the central mystery, there is plenty I've avoided going into, both as it isn't necessary, but also as I firmly believe that Stray God is a game still worth playing. Its central mystery isn't that compelling overall. In hindsight and on subsequent playthroughs, it merely serves as the trunk of the tree, and the foliage is its characters and their individual tales. I never even mentioned Grace's best friend in this video, Freddy, which is a bit of an oversight, but I guess you'll have to play the game to find out. Stray Gods is a special game. A unique concept, airtight characters, well thought out interpretations of the Greek pantheon with a contemporary lens, and a good solid soundtrack to round things out. It's quickly grown to be a personal favourite of mine, one that I will recommend to my dying days. If you have a game you'd like me to try and review, leave a comment. Regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the funny pages.
Finally we'll be free.